Okay, this category we're going to talk about. We're going to talk a bit about the emergency management framework in the United States. So how do we respond to disasters in the United States? I think you can't really be effective in a relief team if you don't know what you're walking into, if you don't know how the structure is set up and where you fit into that structure. So we're going to go through some of that really quick. I'm going to try not to bore you with it. But let's really quick talk about why should we want to help others in need after disaster. The Bible actually has a lot to say about that. James 1:27, religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unsustained from the world. Focusing on in their affliction, right? So if you're a survivor, if you've lost your home, you've lost family members, and you're in that moment, that is you are in your affliction. It's our duty to go and help these people. Do not neglect to do good and share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. So if anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? And then I'll skip over, we're all familiar with this one, where basically anytime that you give food or you give me drink and things like that, it's not only did you do it to the least of these, but you also did it unto me. So I think it goes a little bit deeper than just it's a good thing to do. It's our duty as Christians to share what we have and to help people in their affliction. So objectives of this course here, we're going to talk about the disaster cycle. We're going to talk about what that is and how it works, how governments respond to disasters. We're going to talk specifically a little bit about volunteer organizations that are active in disasters. We call that VOAD. As a disaster relief ministry team, you do fall into the category of VOAD. That's what the government calls you, a VOAD, right? They're all about acronyms and alphabet soup. U.S. emergency management laws that govern response, and the incident command system. Incident command system is how we respond to disasters. It's the methodology behind that. So this is kind of an image of the disaster cycle, being that it is circular in nature because it's always reoccurring. We all know that disasters are going to happen again, right? No matter what we do, we can't stop it. So you've got 4 phases within a disaster cycle. You've got mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. I think this has a pointer on it, but I've got to figure out how to use it. Yep, maybe not. You can see here the orange event. So this is where the disaster occurs. So we've done preparedness, we've trained, we've gotten ready. Disaster occurs, and then you have the response phase. So this is the phase where we're responding with all the resources that we have that we can get to respond to the disaster. Over time, depending on what type of an event that is, what needs need to be met, it transitions into a phase of recovery. The initial response is over. We found all the missing persons. Immediate people that are not housed now have some form of shelter. We want to go back to a sense of normalcy for the individuals in the community. Now we're in the recovery phase. As we rebuild the community, we want to think ahead. What if this happens again? So that's where mitigation efforts get put in place. Let's say, well, I'll have slides about that, but basically this is the opportunity as you rebuild. There's no better opportunity to get ready for it to ever happen again than during rebuilding, right? Okay? So disaster cycle, disaster management aims to reduce or avoid the potential losses from hazards, assure prompt and appropriate assistance to victims of disaster, and achieve rapid and effective recovery. It illustrates the ongoing process by which governments, businesses, and civil society plan for and reduce the impact of disasters. So the mitigation phase. See this picture here? This is an example of a mitigation effort, a physical mitigation effort. Imagine that a hurricane came in and wiped out the home that was on that slab. When we rebuild it, are we going to build it the same way? Probably not. Not if we're smart. This is an example of mitigation. Have you ever noticed in your community, and Texas does this a lot, in your community you have a city soccer field or a park, a public park? If you ever noticed when we have lots of rain, it floods a lot? That's because we call that floodplain management. It's an act of mitigation to put something in that area besides a home that we can use that we don't really need if it floods, right? So that's why a lot of times you see those soccer fields and public parks and things, they flood first because they're in the floodplain. That's another example of mitigation. Preparedness is simply creating plans, training up, so providing training, and you can do disaster drills, things like that. That's all examples of preparedness. Response phase is the disaster has just occurred and we're going in to try and respond to the disaster. Examples of that: search and rescue, emergency relief, first responders. Recovery, returning the community to normal. There's a lot of things the government can provide to help do that. But it's a process and it takes time, oftentimes many years. Joplin, Missouri, with the bad tornadoes went through Joplin, Missouri. To this day, they're almost back, but they're not quite back yet. Recovery is a long process. It is possible to get a sense of normalcy back, but what is usually told to survivors, don't expect it ever to be the same. It'll never be the same, but it can still be great, right? So how do we respond to disasters in the United States? At the federal level, obviously we all know that the Office of the President is the Commander-in-Chief in charge of a response to a disaster, just the same as in war. You've got cabinet secretaries that will also be involved in the disaster response, depending on what type of disaster it is. If we have a pandemic influenza, so we have lots of people becoming sick with some type of a viral fever or whatever it is, the Secretary for Health and Human Services is going to be in charge at the behest of the President. So you have the CDC, NIH, and a lot of those agencies that fall under Health and Human Services that are going to kind of head that response up. If it's a natural disaster, Department of Homeland Security and FEMA are going to be in charge of that. If it's an act of terrorism, like the Las Vegas incident, the Department of Justice will be in charge, and law enforcement, FBI, ATF, and a lot of those individuals will head up and lead the response to that. But here's the great thing about it. We'll talk about incident command system because it doesn't matter where the top is at, depending on the type of disaster, because there's one methodology all disasters are managed in. It doesn't matter who's in charge. So we'll talk about that. Now you can't see, this is kind of an organizational chart. You can't see, not a big deal. This is if there's a need for law enforcement to be in charge. There's a lot of the agencies that head that up. They work with the state police departments as well. Like if there's an incident in Texas, they'll work with the state police. They'll work with local sheriff, local police, and then if needed, depending on what type of a criminal event, FBI may be in charge. Okay. So the National Disaster Medical System is basically a disaster response team. They're first responders that are provided by the federal government to go in the event of a disaster. They deploy in. They're all trained first responders, and when they go in, their job is to provide immediate emergency care, search and rescue, life-saving capabilities, and they can deploy anywhere in the United States. DMAT is within the National Disaster Medical System. They are the actual people that go out. See this tent setup here? This is what it looks like when they deploy to the scene of a disaster. I will tell you that it takes anywhere from 72 hours to 1 week to gather that team of individuals up and get them deployed somewhere in the United States, depending on where it's at. FEMA heads that up, but they'll go in and they'll stay as long as they need to provide initial response to the disaster. DMORT, that's a mortuary operational response team. They're the same type of team. Unfortunately, they go in when there's a mass fatality event where you have lots and lots of people that have lost their lives. One of the things that struck me when I first got into emergency management is how underprepared the government is at all levels to deal with the mass fatality incident. We all think, oh yeah, a lot of people die, they have a plan for that. No, they don't. I can tell you they don't. For example, in where I work, in the Collin County area, you guys may know that there's, I don't know how many we got now, 3 to 5 million people. It's a very large, it's growing all the time. Well, the guy in charge of the, I'm trying to think of the name of it. But anyways, they're inside of Collin County, they have the response to deal with when a person dies, they go to the funerals, they collect the bodies, they do autopsies and things like that. It'll come to me in just a minute. I can't think of the term. But anyways, he told me basically anything more than 6 people at once, they're overwhelmed and they have to come out. They have to get other counties to come in and help. You have 4 or 5 million people. It only takes 6 at one time for them to be overwhelmed. So you can see where a mass fatality is another disaster in itself when you have an incident where you have hundreds or thousands of people at one time. There's also federal teams for coming and assisting animals in a disaster. They'll go in and rescue animals and things like that. Inside of Texas, we have our own task force, same exact example. And we deploy within the state of Texas. I'm actually on this team. And we can go anywhere in the state, bring these shelter systems, provide emergency health care and relief. They're made up of mobile medical units, ambulance strike teams, and on and on. So if it's a traditional event, like I said, FEMA is going to be in charge. Your local Office of Emergency Management for the state is going to be in charge if it happens locally. And then we talked about health from the HHS. Skip through this. So we're about to talk a little bit about incident command system, and the whole concept behind that is whole community preparedness. So for a long time, different governmental agencies, they basically planned in silos. She had people over here planning for something, and then people over in another agency or another level of government planning for the same thing. 2 different policies and procedures. They come and deploy in a response together, and they can't even communicate. It's like the Tower of Babel. It's like, what did they say? So they had to create a common language. How do we communicate? It doesn't matter if you're a police officer. It doesn't matter if you work for the Forestry Service. It doesn't matter who you are. You work in the FBI. You're an emergency management official. We all need to speak the same language. So whole community preparedness. And the fact that it's not just the government's responsibility to keep us prepared, it applies to the community as well. It's everyone's responsibility. It's a sense of personal preparedness, having a family emergency plan. If you have a family, think of, at the family level, think of if this number of disasters happen, how would my family get out? Do my kids have phone numbers if they needed to call me? Do we have a meet-up place? So personal preparedness all the way up. So not just the government, it's not just the government's responsibility to save me. Okay, so that's the idea behind whole community. Faith-based and community organizations, churches, schools, it's everyone's responsibility to come together and prepare together. So this is where, as a disaster relief team, we really fall under this umbrella of VOAD, volunteer organizations active in disaster. So that's how the government classifies us. When we go in as a faith-based organization, and I think I'll have a short little video here in just a little while to show you kind of an example of that. And then other volunteer organizations that are not necessarily faith-based go in. We fall into this category as a second responder organization. And we fall into the response at the disaster scene inside of the incident command system. So throughout emergency management cycle, voluntary organizations assist in a wide range of activities, including damage assessment, mass feeding and sheltering, cleanup and debris removal, construction of temporary housing. We talked about these things, rebuilding, all things that we could be involved in. So you guys have heard of Habitats for Humanity, Samaritan's Purse. There's a long list out there. Red Cross, of course. So that's where we would fall in there. Sorry, this is so small. So capacity building is very important with VOAD. The government, and the reason the federal government, all the way from the top, all the way down, has been preaching this whole community concept is because everyone thinks, well, or it seems like a lot of people think, well, I live and I work here and I do my business, and if something goes bad, the government's going to save me. The government cannot save you. Let me tell you, okay? I'm very familiar with how it works. The government does not have the resources at any level. If you put all the levels together, they do not have the resources to save you. Not in mass quantities of people. So it really takes everyone. So VOAD organizations, like a disaster relief ministry team, they're capacity building. They're building capacity within the community. And if there's a disaster that's widespread, that's why they say it's best to respond to your own community first, because you know the community. You can build capacity within that community to help that community come back to a sense of normalcy. I was working in Waco it was under the HHS I was in regional healthcare emergency preparedness, and lo and behold, we had the West explosion that occurred. Anybody remember the West explosion at the fertilizer plant? And in months after that, what happened was the CDC came in, they went around, they formed these rapid response teams, and they went around to different communities, and they basically questioned people. And the goal was to find out, how long does it take? First of all, what all cascading things have occurred because of this disaster that have changed the way people live their life? And how long is it going to take for them to regain that sense of normalcy? And what they found within 2 years afterward, that there were still people that were completely uprooted. Everything had changed for them in their life because of that event. This is just one building blowing up, right? It had a significant impact to that very small community. That was a community, and that was a community that was very closely knit. I don't know how many people know much about West, the town of West in Texas, but it's a Czechoslovakian small community. A lot of them have lived there their entire lives. They know each other really well. And so you can imagine in a place where there's not quite that sense of community, how much longer it would take to get through that recovery phase and regain that sense of normalcy. So VOADs are very critical in building capacity within a community. So how does the United States, first of all, how did all this get started? Yes, we had emergency management before 9/11. It just didn't look like much, okay? At that time, President George W. Bush created the Department of Homeland Security. You have the Homeland Security Act of 2002. We did have some other ones out there before that. The Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief Act of 1988, yeah. And then shortly following 9/11, we also had the Public Health, Security, and Bioterrorism Preparedness and Response Act of 2002. There's a lot more down through there. I'm not going to go through all of those. Texas has a lot of our own codes as well that falls under the Health and Safety Code that gives us the ability to manage some emergency management aspects there. This is a big one, Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 5. Again, this was a presidential directive, signature by the president at that time, established the National Incident Management System. So this is where we get the Incident Command System. This is that common language between all people. How do we respond to a disaster? So it was this directive that created that system. It was this directive that formalized that system. This system was actually created in the 1970s by the Forestry Service out in California, and it was later adopted by the federal government. So we'll talk about that. So we're going to talk about the Incident Command System really quick. I'm going to go through some terminology. I'd like to show you this quick little video to kind of give you an idea of what the Incident Command System is, and then we'll go through it really quick. Mr. Lee Martin, can you start this video really quick? We're going to watch this, and then we'll come back and talk about Incident Command.